If you watch the Duran and Alexander Mercouris, you may be wondering lately if they have lost it. I've been a daily watcher of the Duran for years, but I am concerned and finding that I am just not tuning in as often. They have lost their judgment about events, I think, and I wonder why. Alexander Mercouris especially seems to have let his hopes for what Donald Trump could be get in the way of observing what is really happening in the world today, what America, the state, is really doing in the world today. Have they suffered Trump derangement syndrome? That is what I want to ask in this short video. I'm Jeff Rich and this is The Burning Archive, where I talk about world history and try to understand the major powers, the major cultures in the world today with a little bit of quality world history. And I think this issue with the Duran and Alexander Mercouris actually does tell us something interesting about how we use history to interpret geopolitics today. We all tell stories about the past, stories about the world. That's what's called history. They shape how we observe and act in the political world, but all our stories are partial. We all make mistakes. We just need to know our limitations. And lately, I fear that Duran, and especially Alexander Mercouris, has not known his limitations. Let's look at some key examples in recent videos. When Alexander Mercouris reported on Donald Trump's inauguration speech in January 2025, he was fulsome in his praise, so much so that he said he had never heard such a optimistic, such a extraordinary, revelatory speech. He even compared it somewhat bizarrely to Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of Britain after the civil wars in the mid-17th century. He has also spoken in excited, praiseworthy terms about the revolution that Donald Trump is implementing in American government, perhaps a little bit hastily on the basis of 2 weeks of media releases and press statements. When Donald Trump's tariff policies were subject to criticism, Alexander Mercouris made a comparison with the policies implemented in the 1930s by Britain that were first articulated by a British statesperson, Joseph Chamberlain, in about 1905. Letting go of the 25 years, including World War I and the Great Depression and all the conflicts of the 1920s. And I commented on that in a recent live stream. Alexander seems to have a deep faith in Donald Trump's sincerity and capacity to be a genuine peacemaker, both in the Russia-Ukraine war as well as in the West Asia or Middle East. And indeed, perhaps he doesn't really even comment on the intents to have an economic war with China. And he has also articulated this rather odd theory that Donald Trump is retrenching the American empire by, making claims over Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal, and other places around the world, potentially even executing regime change operations in Venezuela. And in recent videos, both Alex Cristoforo and Alexander Mercouris seem to have almost adopted a sort of party political sort of mega kind of framework of just saying, trust the American people. That's what Donald Trump should do, as if somehow Alex and Alexander over there in Europe seem to understand what is the current mindset of American people. They frankly seem to be making way too many excuses for Donald Trump's erratic policies, his choices such as Pete Hegseth, his bizarre statements, bizarre, indeed atrocious statements on a whole range of issues. And the apparent lack of method, somehow or other, Alexander seems to think there is a cunning plan behind it all. That any madness is perhaps the result of Trump's underlings, not of the president himself. And when I look back, I've seen this tendency in Alexander's videos for some time. I remember at the time of the EU election, things didn't quite work out as Alexander might have hoped. Effectively, the centrist right, was confirmed in the dominant position in the EU Parliament. But Alexander and Alex wanted to interpret it in quite a different way. When the British elections happened, there was a similar lack of judgment, lack of objectivity, a real buy-in with the Reform Party, and a failure to see that if you split your vote, if the right-wing parties split their vote in a, first-past-the-post system, it's going to destroy the party. And there was some very strange, election analysis put forward by Alexander at that time. But I think one of the things that really sort of made me deeply worried about the kind of judgment of the Duran was their response to the British riots, including, setting fire to buildings. And Alexander's apparent denial that, whenever he asked anyone, no one was rioting. There seemed to be a bit of a moral failure at the time, and I would contrast that to what George Galloway said. And I'm not just saying that here on YouTube, I said that to the Duran at the time. In fact, I cancelled my subscription to the Duran Locals channel at the time as a result of those kind of comments. Similarly, when the Trump shooting occurred, there was this sort of bedazzled response that was the symbol of the hero. Again, I think Alexander let his emotions really get the better of him. And I think he's also rather allowed rather indulged the quite dominant personality of Robert Barnes and his particular perspective on American politics to dominate. And I recall all through the time leading up, I guess, to the handover of power in January, there was a long debate about whether Trump was serious about seeking peace in Ukraine, whether Trump was serious about peace with Russia, whether he was a genuine peacemaker or whether he was just making kind of bizarre election statements. And at one point, Alexander, despite some skepticism from a guest or maybe even from Alex Cristoforo, said, well, I got an email from someone that, I know someone on the inside and I got an email from someone, as if that was firm evidence of Trump's intentions. And of course, those of us who've watched Alexander's coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war would know that he's been talking about the beginning of the end game really now for quite some time in the war, and I wonder whether that framework, notwithstanding the overall assessment that Russia is winning the war and things will have to end at some point, I wonder if that also casts some doubt over the quality of his judgment. And when I look back over that, I sort of think about some of the thinking habits or rhetorical habits that I've observed in Duran videos or Alexander Mercouris videos over the last several years. He frequently says, as a claim to authority of his analysis, I remember when, I remember all the inauguration speeches going back to Richard Nixon. Like, I don't know how old Alexander was in 1968 or 1972. But I'm sure he was perhaps not old, and perhaps memory is playing tricks on him. I remember living through the Cold War, he said recently, as if that gave him some superior level of analysis. He frequently refers to the fact that he studied history at university and did not take that course, followed a course as a lawyer, a journalist. But studying history at university, which I did too, is all very well, but one also has to sort of, refresh one's knowledge since. He frequently says, I'm a grizzled veteran of bureaucracy, that he understands bureaucracy. Now, I'm a smooth-shaven veteran of bureaucracy who'd done a lot of bureaucratic work in 33 years, and I find the Duran's claims to have a deep insight into bureaucracy both fallacious, frankly a little bit gratuitous, and entirely unconvincing. His perspectives on bureaucracy are pretty cliched, I think. He also says, from time to time, I'm a Greek. I have a special understanding of democracy. I have a special understanding of heroism. Both of which are sort of, very odd statements to make. And again, as if the concept of heroism is not rather, multicultural. In fact, the roots of democracy are, found in many parts of the world. And I guess more broadly, there is this fixation on globalists, which I think I'll come back to at a time. But broadly, I think what I'd say is there is a tendency to cover up misjudgments and mistakes. Like, I think their early assessment of the Gaza situation was really quite wrong, and they've sort of fudged that since. I think their anecdotes on personal experience to justify their analysis, again, is really questionable, something you should question them about. And they tend to rely on very old Eurocentric or Euro-Atlantic-centric historical frameworks for geopolitical analysis. Overall, they also have this dreadful self-confirming bias, and I feel that is part of what's going wrong with them at the moment. Now, I'm saying this in concern. I was a member of the Duran community. I participated in live streams, that sort of thing. So I'm not saying this out of, petty motives or spite or to have a cheap shot. The Duran's been incredibly important, source of analysis and information for hundreds of thousands of people around the world over recent times. And it's been wonderful to see its growth and the growth of its authority over time. But with anyone who's commenting, on the alternative media or the mainstream media, including myself, one has to ask, how do they really know that? How wise is their judgment? Are they really applying the right kind of mental model to understand events? And I'm not the only one to have this reaction. Viewers to my channel commented in my recent live stream that they felt that some of Alexander's comments in recent times have really been off base. I sense the Gaggle feel the same way. George Galloway's assessment of issues is really quite strikingly different, including, of course, on the British riots, a point I made to the Duran at the time. Now, some people out there, might impugn their motives in various ways. I'm not going to do that. For me, the more important thing is to really think about what is the mental models, the way of thinking about history and geopolitics that is perhaps showing its limitations in the kind of analysis that Alexander and Alex are doing. Because they are great analysts, perhaps by reflecting a little bit upon some of those limitations, they can get back to some of their strengths and away from some of this Trump derangement syndrome they've been exhibiting recently. Because there are a lot of strengths. The kind of daily coverage they do of world events is extraordinary and taxing, but of course, you can only be across the detail of so much. You can only really question the right mental frameworks of things so much. And the more you sort of are covering battleground events in Ukraine, the less likely you are to sort of step back, have a think about how the broader historical forces are changing. To question some of your assumptions about Donald Trump, about America, about American political culture, about globalists and nationalists. Their coverage of some of the myths in the Western media about Russia has been exceptional. And I'm sure, like you, I am deeply, deeply grateful for their exposure of all the sort of myths about Russiagate and so forth. Their daily coverage of the war, their diplomatic analysis often is really exceptional. And sometimes they genuinely do have deep historical insights. I loved their shows on the Russian Revolution back before the war, and I'm sure they might maybe one day go back to those. And I also think it is a tribute to them that they've built the audience that they have and built the authority so that they have Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, Russian ambassadors, Indian ambassadors, all sorts of exceptional guests in amongst a few more questionable guests, perhaps even including myself. But I feel they have hit the limits of their understanding. Emmanuel Todd, who I've done a number of videos on about his exceptional book, The Defeat of the West, and there's links to those in the video description below, says on his analysis of America that he came to it reluctantly and, with sadness, and because in a way, he said he and most people in, I guess, Western culture have this sort of instinctive admiration for America. We want to believe in America is what he says. And he says that becomes a bit of a block to facing the reality of America. And that's why he introduced the whole concept of nihilism or nihilism into his analysis. And I think we see something similar with Alexander Mercouris, particularly on the Duran in recent times. He wants to believe in a certain kind of Republican, libertarian story about America. The story about America perhaps he absorbed when he did study history at university. The story of America he has absorbed from that very strong tradition within American culture. And he is very much encouraged in that by Robert Barnes. And I think as a result, he doesn't really truly see the way, as Emmanuel Todd, I would argue, does see, that the true state of America is oligarchy and nihilism, and that Donald Trump is just another version of that. He's not the saviour. And I also think they are, in their historical analysis, in their geopolitical analysis, way too focused on what historian John Darwin describes as Greater Europe. They buy into the whole Westphalian concert of Europe kind of story. They don't really understand the deeper story of the rise and fall of global empires that I've been talking about on the channel, based on John Darwin's book After Tamerlan. And Greater Europe is North America, Europe, and Russia. Those topics are always well covered on the Duran and Alexander Mercouris, but they have a lot of weak spots, I think. India, Southeast Asia, China, Korea, Latin America, Africa, Australia. I was surprised really about their simplistic ideas about Australia when I was interviewed by them on the show. And they are also, I think, particularly fixated on the European Union. They have a real grudge about the European Union. Alexander admits himself he has a kind of personal feeling about Emmanuel Macron that leads him astray sometimes. But more deeply, they really buy into the sort of globalist versus nationalist perspective, which I think simply does not comprehend the real history of globalization and the multipolar world. And I'll talk more about that on the channel shortly. So fundamentally, despite their curiosity and interest in history, they, Alexander Mercouris especially, I think, are relying on some very old mental models, relying too much on the sense that they've got it right, self-confirming bias, and they haven't really updated their mental models of world history to adapt to the changing world, the changing distribution of power, the changing distribution of culture, the changing distribution of political ideas. They still believe in this sort of old American idea of the sort of Atlantic Republic. I'm going to keep watching the Duran. I may not keep watching it daily anymore because I'm just not getting as much value from it. And frankly, that might be a good thing. We should all be looking out for new voices, new perspectives, watching people who we disagree with and questioning our own mental models about things. And I fear with the Duran's success over the last few years, it's apparent correct assessment of some key issues that they've let their 5 minutes of internet fame get to their heads just a little bit. But I might be wrong. But most of all, I think it might be good for the Duran too to reflect upon some of their models of history and geopolitics that they bring to their analysis. And I encourage you too to update your mental models of world history and the major powers and cultures of the world. That's what I try to do here on the Burning Archive YouTube channel and at my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com, where all through 2025 I'm doing a world tour of a world history tour of world powers, looking at the USA, looking at China, India, Russia, and the European Union as, you know, 5 of the major powers and cultures of the world, civilization states, you could even maybe call them. And I think that is a great way for you to get some different perspectives on what the Duran is saying, what I'm saying. Question some of your own assumptions about the world. And if you really want to get some, I really encourage you to go over to jeffrich.substack.com. You can join for free or become a paid subscriber. And you can also watch my series on the rise and fall of global empires from 1400 to 2000 or 2024. That is looking at the real stories of world history, not from a Euro-Atlantic perspective, not from a globalist versus nationalist perspective, not from an American perspective or Anglo-American perspective, but a much broader multicultural, global, historical perspective. And you can watch that playlist right here. Thanks for watching.